I'm joined today by Eric Helms PhD, an active researcher in the areas of maximum strength development, fat loss, hypertrophy, and competitive physique and strength sport. He is the co-founder and regular contributor to the monthly Applications in Strength Sport Research Review, and is the author of the Muscle and Strength Nutrition and Training Pyramids books. Eric also coaches a handful of drug-free strength and physique athletes through a 3D Muscle Journey, which he co-founded in 2009. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Absolutely a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, so many great areas to cover here today, talking bodybuilding, training for physique. But, before we jump in here, Eric, maybe if we can give listeners a little more on your background and how you got into the research side of things.
For sure. Yeah, I started out like many people do in the iron game, just fell in love with lifting. And that was around 2005. I was in my early 20s and really just got bit by the bug, as they say. And I got involved with both competitive powerlifting in 2006, and then I did my first natural bodybuilding shows in 2007. Became a personal trainer. I tend to get pretty obsessed with anything I do, so both the science, the practice, and the community of the sport all really intrigued me. So I wanted to study it. I got my first personal training certification in 2005, and then it just kind of kept going from there. And every step of the way, I thought, maybe I can take this a little bit further, and that eventually culminated in coming out to New Zealand to do my PhD. And also a master's. The master's focus was in protein and macronutrient requirements for dieting strength athletes. So a lot of overlap with physique athletes as well there. And then for the PhD that I just finished, I was looking at strategies for auto-regulating training in powerlifters. And all the way I've been working with strength and physique athletes and doing my own thing as well as an athlete, and proving to be just slightly above average. So it's been good.
That's awesome and phenomenal to have both sides of the coin there with the real practical base and, of course, all your work in terms of the research. So, maybe the best place to kick things off here is everyone's favorite topic, which is protein. So with all the lifting, cardio, restricting calories, how does all this impact the protein requirements for, say, a bodybuilder or someone who's more physique focused in terms of the training?
That's a great question. Yeah, and the research is evolving in this area, but I originally started with the hypothesis that, we have all these independent factors which drive a higher protein need, activity being one of them. And then while resistance training doesn't actually drive a higher protein need, it's more so that if you are resistance training, you can make better gains on a higher protein diet relative to, say, the RDA or kind of habitual intake. And then as you get leaner, there's shifts in energy metabolism. So a recent study that came out of Stu Phillips' lab is they found that in overweight individuals, if they are going into a diet, protein synthesis is suppressed. But other data shows that if you are a non-overweight individual, not only that, but also protein degradation increases. So there's a decent theoretical argument for trying to increase your protein while dieting. It's unknown if it's truly, we don't have the best quality evidence to determine that, yes, indeed, a higher protein intake will, beyond what you would need when you're not dieting, is going to guard against muscle mass losses. But at the very least, it's probably helpful for satiety and maybe enhancing energy expenditure to some degree because of some of the effects of protein and how it is difficult to convert into energy. So it's certainly something that should be high for someone who's lifting weights and is dieting. The question is how high, and right now I think our best evidence would be somewhere between 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kg when you're in a state of energy balance. So that's about 0.7 to 1 gram per pound. And then when you are in a state of energy deficit, maybe kicking that up a little bit, about like 0.2 grams per kg, somewhere in the range of just below a gram per pound up to maybe like 1.3, 1.4 grams per pound at most. So that's kind of where we're at right now with our best guess. There's not a ton of research where we're dieting people over long-term periods while they're getting very lean. So a lot of this is kind of extrapolating from existing data and experience of working with lifters, but that's probably a non-harmful level for sure, and likely won't impact your carbohydrate or fat intake.
That's a great point to be able to differentiate between when people are in a caloric excess or a sufficient amount of calories versus, especially in something like bodybuilding, we're getting into that caloric deficit and the protein requirements then, potentially being a lot higher. And if we stay on the caloric deficit side of things here, obviously classically this idea of 500 kcals per day over the course of a week, leads to this gain or loss, in this case, a loss of body fat. Can you talk about that as a general way to think of things and how individuals may differ in their responses?
Yeah, that's kind of in the classic rule. If you generate an energy deficit of 3,500 calories, which is roughly the amount of calories that should be in a pound of adipose tissue, knowing that fat tissue isn't completely fat, there's some water in there, and then multiplying the number of grams by 9, you get roughly 3,500. And it's a decent proxy. The issue, though, and if you look at some of the research by Kevin Hall, is that you can't just look at it as math. If you simply create an energy deficit of 500 and then expect yourself to lose a pound continuously, that just doesn't happen in the real world. And there's a number of reasons for that. Is one, people aren't great at estimating their caloric intake. Food labels aren't incredibly accurate. They also tend to overestimate their energy expenditure. And on the other side of it, the energy expenditure actually changes in response to energy intake. So there's immediate drops in the thermic effect of food. You're eating less food, so it takes less total energy to process it. It's a small amount, but it's still there. And then more significantly, things like non-exercise activity thermogenesis, just how much you move on a day-to-day basis, goes down. And also, as you lose weight, you're moving less mass, so you're going to burn less calories moving. And at a micro level, things like muscular efficiency increase. So you require less ATP for the same level of movement to some small degree, which adds up over time. And kind of the overarching name for all that at the same time is what's called adaptive thermogenesis. And you can have huge responses in some individuals and very small responses in others. So this could be on average probably, after you've lost, say, 10 pounds, you're burning about 15% calories less than you'd expect at a given body weight. But if you go out 2 standard deviations from that to cover kind of like 95% of people, that means some unlucky folks out there, after they've dieted, are going to be burning about 2/3 of the calories you'd expect them to. So the math doesn't always add up on an individual basis. So you have to look at it as a more of a dynamic thing and adjust the calories as needed to keep at a consistent level of weight loss. So I like to focus more on initially setting up your calories based on that kind of loose guideline, the 3,500 calorie rule, if you will.
Yep. And
then making adjustments over time. And I think a decent rule of thumb for someone who's not overweight is you want to lose about 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week. And if you're not seeing that, that's when you can make kind of those 100, 150 calorie shifts downward when you're a little below. Or likewise, if you're above that target, you can add more calories back in, because losing too quickly is a pretty good predictor of unnecessary lean body mass losses.
Yeah, I was going to ask, obviously, in the trainers working with general population, especially, people want to see this dramatic and quick transformation in terms of body composition. So when we see some of these, dramatic caloric deficits, what's the potential pitfalls for people in terms of trying to lose weight?
That's a great question, and this is an interesting one, because there's some research showing that when you have an overweight individual who's significantly overweight, probably obese, faster weight loss initially does predict success long term. But that's not the case when you're dealing with someone who's just slightly overweight, or an athlete trying to lose weight, or someone who's just trying to maintain a leaner physique, and if you think about it, that makes sense. When you have Everest to climb, being able to make some quick progress makes the rest of it feel doable. And taking these small steps when you're looking up and going, man, that's a tall mountain, can be quite discouraging. So certainly there's a time and a place for faster weight loss. But when I'm talking faster weight loss, I don't mean Biggest Loser stuff, And
Sure.
As a personal trainer, one of the most frustrating things is when you have someone come in and you set some realistic expectations, and they're so far from what the person is expecting as to be discouraging. When someone watches, these contestants on Biggest Loser, just because I'm picking on them right now, losing, 10 to 20 pounds a week to start, and you tell them, hey, we can go at a good clip and lose 2 to 3 pounds per week at the start. That's really fast if you think about it. You're losing more than 10 pounds a month at that speed.
Absolutely.
And that probably should slow down over time. But when they're expecting that per week, I think that can be discouraging. So I think it's really important to set realistic expectations, to know the probable issues with trying to lose that fast. If you are indeed losing as fast as you possibly can, it's just simply not sustainable. And if you look at the hard facts, which are pretty discouraging, almost everybody can lose weight. The problem is they gain it back. Within 1 to 2 years, we're looking at like a 90% recidivism, basically, of going back to or above the starting body weight that people lost. And I think a large part of this is that the fitness industry pushes quick fixes, and it doesn't do a good job of promoting lifestyle change. And I think it's difficult to really kind of conceptualize early on that, hold on, my entire life I now plan to be eating healthy and exercising. It's much more easy just for the human brain to focus on the next 12 weeks. And if you're going to only focus on 12 weeks, well, you better make sure you make a difference. But the problem is that there's no game plan after those 12 weeks. You tend to just slide backwards. And you combine that with adaptive thermogenesis and increases in hunger from being restricted. And sometimes you see people end up worse off than when they started.
Yeah, it's definitely, especially in the general population, with the environment being laden with so many hyper-palatable foods too. Once that hunger kicks up, it's pretty difficult to offset that. Now, if we're talking bodybuilders or figure competitors, and how do they game plan things when they're so many months out of a competition? Is there a general rule of thumb in terms of the amount of months and again the weight loss per week?
Yeah, absolutely. And bodybuilding is an interesting thing because the standards for competition have changed over time. If you were to look back even a couple decades, the standard length diet would be like about 12 weeks. And then a long diet would be 16 weeks. And you still see that sometimes in the drug using side of the sport, but among the tested side of the sport, when you're dealing with drug-free lifters and competitors, that is typically a recipe for not getting lean enough, or if you do get lean enough, going through hell to get there.
Gotcha.
And typically not showing up on stage looking full with all the muscle mass you started with. So it's important to realize that the difference between bodybuilding in the 1980s was that no one even really knew that glutes were striated, in male bodybuilding. And nowadays, the standard for conditioning is so high that you really have to have the complete absence of visible body fat to do well. That means you need to have striations in your glutes, veins in your abs and in your inner thigh, complete separation everywhere. And what that means is that when you look at someone, your standard fitness model on the cover of a magazine, that if they're a male, they're probably 10 to 15 pounds over stage weight, which is surprising given how good they look.
For sure.
And that was about what you would need, the kind of shape you'd need to get in to compete in, say, the 70s or 80s. So there's just more fat to lose to be competitive, and that means you need to take longer to do it. And as you get leaner and leaner, losing fat becomes harder and harder. Because if you think about it, when you're, let's say you competed 170 pounds and you start your diet at, 200 pounds, you've got 30 pounds to lose. But those 1 pound of those 30 pounds is a small percentage when you weigh 200. But when you're 175, losing 1 pound is a fifth of the body fat you need to lose. So expecting to be able to do it in the same amount of time and expecting that to have the same effects on your body, because fat is not inert tissue. It produces hormones, and it has a large impact on things like satiety, things like hormonal production in your body, the nervous system, all kinds of stuff. So the way you feel at the end of a diet, even when you do things right, for a bodybuilder is pretty miserable at times. So game planning is very important. So I think the average length of a diet for a male competitive bodybuilder these days, it's about 6 months. And for women, it tends to be more like 7. If they're, depending on the division they compete in, not all of them require you to get as lean. But for getting maximally lean, say if you're a female bodybuilder or a male bodybuilder, we're looking at 6 or 7 months or so. And that means, okay, well then there's going to be a recovery period because this is pretty rough on the body. And that typically takes about 2 to 3 months before everything is, you start to feel human again. And if you think about it, that leaves you with 4 months before the next season starts, before you have to diet again. So you see a trend these days of people competing every other year or taking long off seasons. And really the folks who should be competing every year or who can get away with it, and who still do well are the pros who have, really kind of built their physique for the most part, and it's more about retaining a title, and only being able to make small improvements anyway. It's not the end of the world if they don't have much of an off season, and they've also refined their diets so they can be more efficient, effective, and they're good at getting recovered quickly. So I think there's a big shift that's occurred, especially in the natural side of the sport in the last 10, 15 years, as the requirements for success have become more extreme.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially obviously the stress involved in terms of cutting and training at that level. And if, shifting gears here to a different macro in terms of carbohydrates, obviously a strategy that can be employed is reducing carbohydrates sometimes significantly, but what are some of the consequences of insufficient carb intake if athletes or bodybuilders are still training, intensely and trying to grow?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, carbohydrate is important to some degree for bodybuilders. I would say it's not as important as for an athlete with a much higher energy expenditure. If you are a soccer player or if you're a marathon runner, the kind of carbohydrate intake and also the subsequent energy intake from taking in a high level of carbohydrates is going to be a lot higher, and should be a lot higher if you really want to maximize performance based on what we know. Now, for a bodybuilder, sure, they are anaerobic athletes. You're probably training anywhere in the 4 to 20 rep range for most of the time, and some of that will certainly deplete glycogen. Glycogen being the stored form of carbohydrate in humans. And depending on how much volume you're doing, a weight training session can deplete, say, maybe 10 to 30% of the local muscle glycogen, and that is enough to induce fatigue. Now, you might think, oh, that's a big deal. But the thing is you're also not typically training the same muscle group again, within the same day. If you have a normal day of eating, you wake up, you have breakfast the next day, and then you go train again, that local muscle glycogen is probably completely, if not all the way, replenished if you're on a normal diet. Now, when you're dieting, that's a different scenario, because you have a obligatory reduction in calories. That means you're going to have to find somewhere for it to cut from, and carbohydrates is often one of, but not the only culprit. Typically, it's both fat and carbohydrates that have to come down at some point in a diet.
Yep.
And so then you're dealing with, okay, I am depleting glycogen in training, and I am restricting carbohydrate to some degree. So maybe I am running into some issues with glycogen. Even though I'm only training, let's say, each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week, I'm kind of in this chronically depleted state. And especially when it comes to the lower body, I'm also doing cardio typically at some point. So that's why it's important to modulate the intensity of cardio, to kind of think about how it fits in with the rest of your training. I'm not a huge fan of doing a lot of high intensity cardio for bodybuilders because of the potential interference effect on training, especially during dieting. So I think there's a time and place for some of it, but it needs to be carefully planned. And for this reason, you want to try to, for the most part, diet on as many carbohydrates as you can, with a big emphasis on you, because some people,
personalized approach becomes key, right?
Exactly. I've had clients who that means they're getting down to under 100 grams. I've had clients who are on their low days above 300 grams, and that's not just due to body mass or activity levels. There are definitely individual differences. We've got a fair amount of research now that shows that insulin resistance or sensitivity can predict whether or not you would be more successful on a lower or higher carb diet, and concomitantly a lower or higher fat intake, vice versa kind of thing. Now, not to say that I think many bodybuilders are insulin resistant. In fact, quite the opposite. They're typically healthy, lean, health conscious people who are quite active. But there's a lot of things that goes into that beyond just those factors. Your age, your genetic history, your ethnicity even. These are all things that can affect the way you metabolize carbohydrates. So we can't really predict very well whether or not you would respond better to one or the other, but there's always trial and error. And typically that means you're going to be somewhere in the range of a gram per pound up to maybe 2 or 3 grams per pound, depending on the individual, in say the off season, and then maybe shift that down a little bit, another half a gram per pound or so, or a full gram per pound when you're dieting, with some reduction in fat as well. But you can only go so low for each one of the macronutrients. You probably don't want to be cutting protein. And you don't want to cut carbs so low that you end up sacrificing your training quality and your muscle fullness. And you also don't want to cut your fat too low, because then you start to have issues with fat-soluble vitamins. You can have issues with hormone production. You can have issues with just mouthfeel and satiety, and not feeling and having adherence problems with low-fat diets. But so long as it's a temporary period, you can get away with a drastic cut in any one of those areas. So it's important to kind of periodize your diet. I use intermittent diet breaks as a way to get around this, high days and low days, so that we might go five low days in a row, then 2 high days to replenish glycogen and just replenish sanity before diving in again. For sure. And these seem to be pretty important for getting through a diet that has to last as long as it does.
And in terms of kind of eyeballing that carb intake per individual, are there some general, do you tie that into some performance metrics in terms of what they're able to do in the gym? Is it all based on physique and look? Are there some rough parameters that people can use to gauge that measure?
Man, it would be nice, but there's so many interacting variables there that I typically start with a general kind of range, and then go with personal preference. And then if I get to work with someone over a long period, we can try different setups. One thing I like to do is keep protein fixed, and then try a diet that is 20% fat, and then try a diet that is 40% fat. And this I typically like to do in the off season, so you can kind of disconnect it from some of the issues of hunger. Because a lot of the times what you crave in the middle of a diet isn't necessarily indicative of what is best for you. There's so many factors that go into hunger and appetite and satiety and things like that are outside of what might determine your best performance.
Absolutely.
It's still important. It's still important because bodybuilders aren't robots, as much as they like to believe. You have to think about, adherence here. But like in the off season, if we can take a 2-month stint of increasing carbs and dropping fat to 20%, and then a 2-month stint of increasing fats to 40% and dropping carbs, and then seeing subjectively how we feel, how performance is, and just kind of looking at it with that bird's eye view over the 2 months, even getting some subjective rating scales going for say sleep, mood, things like that. Then we can get a good idea if there's much of a difference. And in my experience, most people don't really have a significant difference there if they're young bodybuilders who are in the sport. And that may change over time, and it's not everybody, but when it does make a difference, it can make a significant difference. So it's definitely worth experimenting with to see where you fall.
That's terrific. Great point. And if we could actually just circle back, you mentioned obviously the fats and the connection between dietary fat and some anabolic hormones. How does lowering fat intake, if someone were to go that road, or perhaps it's in the lead up to competition, how does that impact things like testosterone levels potentially?
Yeah, there's been some lines of research looking at that, and you certainly can see if your fat intake is too low, or if other things are too low. There's actually a lot of complex variables that go into testosterone production. But the most impactful thing on your hormone levels is the deficit itself in dieting. And I don't want anyone to think that, if I can just maintain 1 gram per kilo of fat intake or higher throughout my whole diet, that my testosterone is going to be intact. It most definitely will not. I've seen there's a handful of case studies now that have been published on bodybuilders, natural bodybuilders going through a whole prep. And for the most part, whenever they measure hormones, they see reductions in testosterone pretty significantly, regardless of the macronutrient breakdown. So I think it's more of an issue of you just don't want to go too low, not to think if I just keep my fat high, it'll preserve everything. It won't. A lot of this is a consequence of starvation and a deficit. With that said, I think based on the limited data we have, you probably don't want to go below, say, 0.5 grams per kg as a fat intake, and that's still pretty low. And I'd like not to get there in the first place, but in the end, when you're dieting for a show, you're going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul. There's really no way around it. Sure. In most cases, one of your macronutrients, or the amount of cardio you're doing, or both, is going to have to be in a position where you don't want it to be, or you'd be walking around lean all the time, right? So it's a matter of what's the lesser of two evils. And I often do this less on hypothetical guesses about what it's going to do to someone's hormone levels, and more so based on what do they think they can handle, and How does it fit with their lives? Where's their stress levels, etc.
Yeah, I mean, great advice. And I was really surprised to see that the testosterone levels can obviously be lower for many months after competition as well, which kind of reflects the, how stressful the process is. And is there any play here between saturated fats and unsaturated fats, or is it come down to more just the total caloric intake?
There is some play there. I mean, but it's more like if you are deficient in saturated fats, there's a problem, not like there's a dose response with it. And people also seem to get a little confused between the effect of cholesterol and saturated fat. They kind of talk about them as though they are the same. And it's not very difficult to maintain your cholesterol intake. That's like, have an egg per day and you're good. So I would say that yes and no. There isn't a dose response with saturated fat, but if you are really, really low in it, there is some evidence that might result in a lower testosterone level. But I think that is not that hard to maintain, even during a diet, if you just have a decent amount of food variety and you keep in some sources.
Oh, good stuff. Good to hear. And what about another area that's sort of obviously become much more popular in the last few years is on the ketogenic side of things in terms of bodybuilding with ketogenic diets. Is that an application that's potentially has some benefit in terms of health implications with blood sugar control, maybe as athletes get older? Is it simply just a different way to achieve the same end goals?
For the most part, the hype around ketogenic diets and the research on them are quite far from one another.
Pretty dramatic, right?
Yeah. And the conversations about them, even among relatively educated circles, has become polarized too, which is concerning to me, because I would say if you just look at the research and you get off social media for a week, you can basically see that the ketogenic diet and a low-fat, high-carb diet that's calorie controlled produce very similar levels of weight loss when you look at meta-analytic data. Maybe one leans this way, one leans the other way, but you've got nearly, I think, double-digit meta-analyses at this stage, and none of them show a distinct advantage of one over the other. There are some interesting things about the ketogenic diet, that it seems to result in a reduction in caloric intake when doing ad libitum feeding initially, meaning that as you are shifting over to a higher protein, higher fat diet and dropping out your carbohydrates, you're going to kind of subconsciously, without really notice it, like start dieting without trying to. We've seen that in our lab. But this effect goes away and starts to climb back up. So this combination of having about 2 to 4 weeks of just being more satiated than normal and therefore eating less calories, and also losing a fair bit of water and glycogen, results in some pretty quick weight loss, then stays there. So that's cool. You can think about applications for that. But at the same time, being too low in carbohydrates can also impact performance. So there's a potential trade-off. So there's interest in strategies around how can I avoid that trade-off. And I think, like we talked about earlier with personalized nutrition, not everyone is going to do well on a restricted carbohydrate diet, and some people will do very poorly on it, and others will thrive on it. So I think that's the main focus, and the main takeaway is that probably the reason why the meta-analytic data shows more or less a wash doesn't mean that as an individual, you doing one or the other, it won't make any difference. It just means that there's enough individuals who do well on one and well on the other that it averages out at a population level to not make a difference. So it's still worth experimenting individually. That said, I don't see the need to go to the point where you're actually ketogenic, which, depending on the definition, might be less than 25, 50, or 100 grams of carbohydrate per day. When many of the theoretical benefits and things that you see occurring that are positive due to a ketogenic diet can be achieved on a lower carb diet that's not yet ketogenic, say like 1 gram per kg of carbohydrate. I think there's probably too much mystique around being in a state of nutritional ketosis. The line in the sand of seeing your ketone levels at 0.5 is just that, a line in the sand. There's no empirical reason why that was chosen as the point where we say, yep, that's when you're in nutritional ketosis. The reality is you're going to be 0.2, 0.3 just after an overnight fast. Anytime you're fasted or haven't eaten for a while, or been restricted for carbohydrates for a while, ketones are a normal substrate for energy that we use. We have ketogenic amino acids, and when we're restricting carbohydrates, we will create more ketones. It is something that we use regularly in the body, and it achieving a point that is 0.5 cutoff is not necessarily magic, in my opinion. And I think the over focus on ketones has led to some pretty wacky things, like reducing protein intake on a ketogenic diet to try to not have to make sure that your nutritional ketones are the highest. And I think that's kind of missing the forest for the trees. Like any potential benefit here is largely due to satiety, and you wouldn't want to try to remove that by dropping in the most satiating macronutrient, and also what's arguably going to be protecting against lean body mass losses. And there's a fair amount of research showing that a large portion of the benefits of going on a low carb, high fat diet is that you typically increase protein as well. Protein and fat rise, and there's a good line of research showing that a lot of the proposed weight loss benefits shown in some of the earlier research on high-fat, low-carb diets is actually not due to the low-carb component, but rather due to the high-protein component. And when you match for protein, these differences get washed out, and that's when you see this kind of either-or kind of preference. It doesn't really matter at the population level. So I think especially for athletes, you just need to be careful about probably erring on the side of seeing as many carbs as you can eat, but still taking the time to experiment with lower intakes and not thinking that the lower the better. I don't think we have any data to support that. And we had a ton of athletes or bodybuilders, I should say, getting on stage absolutely peeled, who are on moderate and high carbohydrate intakes while still being calorie restricted. So I think it's time to let go of the pure hypothesis that insulin drives fat storage, and understand it's more complex than that, and that insulin doesn't necessarily predict, is not the only predictor of whether or not you're going to be losing body fat.
Yeah, I mean, great advice, and especially in terms of the biomarkers, all of a sudden, clients or sometimes even athletes start chasing these biomarkers instead of some real hard performance metrics of what they're actually trying to achieve. So it sounds like that individualized approach is key, and maximizing the benefits while mitigating all these risks is crucial. And if we kind of shift gears and onto the supplement side of things, like in terms of supplementation for bodybuilding, physique-oriented trainees, what are sort of the ones in terms of the evidence base that are really showing some benefit for bodybuilders?
That's a great question. And the supplement industry has always been part and parcel with the bodybuilding industry, and so much of the funding to athletes and coaches, and so much of the income and support for shows and support for federations is tied into the supplement industry. So it's no surprise that the importance of supplements are very much overblown in the bodybuilding community. I remember when I started out as an athlete, there was basically like three pillars that I thought, there's supplements, training, and nutrition, and
all
they're
equal,
almost
right.
Right, exactly. They're almost seen as equal, and maybe on the untested side of the sport, where drug use at a certain level is obligatory to be successful, you could make that argument if supplements are replaced with drugs. But for the natural bodybuilder, or for someone who isn't interested in going that route, supplements make up a very, very small piece of the puzzle, and even the most tried and true time-tested supplements that do have an impact on variables that are relevant to bodybuilders, like say creatine, aren't going to make such a difference that you always even notice it. But they still do something. It's just below the threshold to which we can perceive it consistently. Some people take creatine and don't notice it, but we know that very, very consistently in the literature, creatine monohydrate seems to improve not only muscular performance, but also lean body mass. But there's others too. It hasn't changed a lot over the years, but some emerge and then some, fall under scrutiny and kind of collapse as the good research is done. But for the most part, we know that creatine and caffeine are probably the most consistent potential supplements to aid in performance. Caffeine has a number of beneficial effects that are useful to bodybuilders. It suppresses tiredness, which can be very helpful when you're lethargic from dieting and have to go train. And at higher dosages, it can improve performance. Typically, this is more consistent in muscular endurance tests, but it also does seem to improve strength at higher doses, just less consistently. And more often, it seems to be in the lower body versus the upper body, which might be because I think this is because it's also an analgesic to some degree, and training legs is just hard.
It just hurts, right?
Yeah,
And any recommendations around, obviously, when you're pushing that higher end of caffeine, and athletes will feel good in the very short term, at kind of starting to tread that line at that upper end of intake, some adverse symptoms. Is there strategies you have, or do you find your athletes perform fine with that kind of 5 to 6 milligrams per kg?
Man, it's crazy because the 6 milligrams per kg, 5 to 6 milligrams per kg is what is consistently the most consistent performance enhancer in the research. But the side effects of that and how you feel and the jitteriness, and if you take that even after noon sometimes, that can really have a profound negative effect on sleep. And so much of the caffeine research is short term. It's, what happened in this crossover study.
Exactly.
We had this, it doesn't tell you, and how was their sleep, for the rest of the 3 months when they kept doing this. So I think you have to be careful. And there's a ton of research now just on showing that we have different levels of responders to caffeine. We should probably be moving more towards kind of like individual response to caffeine. And so I would say for anyone, you want to start with the lowest effective dose where you can that you tolerate easily and still feel a boost in your training. So starting around like that 3 milligrams per kg and seeing what you get out of that an hour prior to maybe your only your hard training sessions, so you can avoid some of the habituation to it. Is not a bad idea, and then only going higher if there's not a benefit, because sometimes I think the potential negatives can offset any potential benefit. So what I typically recommend is start around 3 milligrams per kg an hour before your hardest training sessions, so maybe no more than say 2 or 3 times per week. So you've got 4 days where you're not taking pre-workout caffeine. You can still have it in your daily life, a cup of coffee here and there, so that's no problem. And then as a general rule, try not to go above, in any given day, 6 milligrams per kg. And then, of course, adjust based on individual results. And I would probably try to do your training sessions, say, before 2 or 3 p.m. on days you're going to take caffeine.
Yeah, great advice. And as your lifters get more elite, is it, do you have a preference more to supplemental form so you can kind of keep tabs on the dose versus like just a cup of coffee, or is it, is it all kind of a wash? Or
I typically like just like actual caffeine tablets or a pre-workout, because you're trying to drink enough coffee to get to that supplemental level before you train. That's good.
Now you got to go to the bathroom.
Yeah,
throws everything off, right?
Exactly. There can be some practical concerns there. But sure. I think it's up to the individual. And coffee does have other things in it besides caffeine. And it's there's some epidemiological data which shows coffee is actually relatively healthy as far as what we know at this stage. But there's a lot to that. Epidemiological data is not cause and effect. That could be that people who drink a lot of coffee also engage socially more often. Dan John, I heard mention that. He was like, well, you think about it, both wine and coffee tend to be shown to extend life and improve quality of life. Is that just because those are social drinks? Do they have more friends? Because that could be a confounding factor.
Absolutely.
Or it could be, the various antioxidants that are in wine and coffee, and it has not much to do with the caffeine itself. It's tough to know. But yeah, for purely the performance side of it, I think it's probably easier to know how much you're taking when you're taking caffeine pills or pre-formulated supplements, because coffee can vary quite wildly depending on how it's produced.
Yep.
But yeah, caffeine and creatine are your big performance supplements. There's a couple others that kind of make the list, but not always, and that's beta-alanine and citrulline malate. Now, those are both basically what I would classify as like muscular endurance eating supplements. Beta-alanine seems to have a beneficial effect for efforts lasting probably a little bit longer than 30 seconds, up to kind of like a few minutes. So that doesn't always encompass what bodybuilders are doing. Granted, there's many ways to skin a cat in bodybuilding. You can do a lot of high rep training or a high rep training block. If you're training for the most part 15 reps and higher, maybe you would want to take beta-alanine. If you tend to be in the more traditional 6 to 12 range all the time, you probably won't see a benefit. And then citrulline malate is kind of similar. It's been shown as basically a supplement that can enhance your capacity to do volume. Citrulline and malate both individually can have an effect on your ability to produce work. Citrulline being a blood flow enhancer, and potentially buffering ammonia, and then malate being a Krebs cycle intermediate. Their combined intake has, for the most part, in about 5 out of 7 studies on weightlifting, shown to have a beneficial effect, but not consistent. So I don't think it's going to have a huge impact, but it could help you perform a little more volume. Like, let's say you're to take a fixed load and try to do 3 sets of as many reps as you can. More often than not, in the research, it shows that those taking 8 grams citrulline malate about an hour prior are able to get more total reps across those sets than the individual not. So those are all basically the performance supplements that have been shown to be consistently useful. The other ones are more about general health and ensuring that everything's in place, which become increasingly important when you're dieting. Things like vitamin D, things like fish oil, things like a general all-purpose multivitamin that's not overdosed like your typical bodybuilding multivitamins.
Yeah. And how about two that are obviously really common that in the literature we don't see as much actual evidence for, but that seem to just be again for recreational trainees and whatnot. Arginines or glutamines seem to be common ones that are in gym bags. What does the research really show in terms of where we're at with those?
Yeah, arginine has not been shown to be that effective at enhancing blood flow, and to my knowledge, as a single supplement, it's never been shown to actually increase performance or lean body mass, despite the fact that it is. The thing is even when arginine does enhance blood flow, then we have to guess, okay, is that enhancement in blood flow enough to actually make any kind of clinical, meaningful outcome in lean body mass or performance? And blood flow is not a powerful thing. As much as we all love to listen to Arnold talk about the pump, it plays some role in nutrient delivery. It plays some role in creating intercellular swelling, which might enhance hypertrophy. But just a small increase in blood flow, that's really not going to do much. So I think citrulline is actually a better driver of enhancement of blood flow than arginine is. So if someone is looking for that, I think citrulline malate would probably be a better choice, and it at least shows semi-consistent results in terms of performance outcomes that should be beneficial for a bodybuilder. So I think arginine probably doesn't make the list. I think it's been pretty consistently shown to not be that effective. And then glutamine, there's been a ton of research where they're actually giving it intravenously to burn victims, and it's great for healing. But it's been some extrapolations into then taking it orally, and the issue is that something like 80% of glutamine is taken up in the gut, and it never even makes it to your muscles to really assist with muscle repair, which it could theoretically do. And like arginine, there's been no research to show any kind of beneficial effects for recovery from training, or beneficial effects on performance or lean body mass accrual from taking glutamine. There is some data showing improvements in gut health, but I think that's something that I don't think that's like a requirement. Like, I think we become a little over-focused on the gut these days with kind of the in some communities in the nutritional world, and it's like, well, if you're having gut problems, maybe you could consider that. But the first thing I would do is go see your general practitioner, before you just, because you could have a serious issue that you're just trying to be like, oh, I'll just get some glutamine, like, well, what if you have an ulcer? It's not going to. Yeah,
glutamine's not going to help. And another one is with infections and immunity. Glutamine seems to be one that people go to that in the research, there's just very, like you mentioned, unless you're actually like a burn victim or in real trouble, there's not a lot of good evidence that it's going to help you on the immune side either.
Yeah, unless you're injecting it, but people aren't doing that, So I would agree. Glutamine and arginine and also branched chain amino acids are probably the ones that are commonly taken without much evidence basis.
Gotcha. Now, if we shift gears here to talk peak week before a competition, you mentioned the pump, things like dehydration. How does that impact guys and gals before they go on stage, and how does that potentially hinder their ability to perform on competition day?
For sure, and this is one where we can't rely too much on research, because there's been a total of one study ever on carbohydrate loading for actual changes in muscle circumference. But so peak week, you have to think about it more from a physiological basis and what is happening. We do know that someone dehydrated has a massive loss of water from their muscle tissue. So this, and considering how much water there is in muscle, that means you would think you'd have the appearance of being smaller. And that certainly matches up with what I've seen. When people drastically cut water, they look smaller. Now, again, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's coached hundreds of natural bodybuilders. I haven't worked with a lot of guys on gear or gals, and I know that practice is a lot more common on the drug side of the sport. And if you think about it, anabolic steroids can help maintain muscle fullness through a few mechanisms. And then if they're androgenic in nature, that can, just like a woman might retain more water on her period, that can result in someone retaining more water while they're on certain drugs. So perhaps that trade-off is worth it when you are on specific drugs, and cutting water does make you look leaner without sacrificing muscle fullness. I'm not confident in that claim, but I at least can't discount it. But for the most part, I don't think there is any reason to cut water in someone who's drug-free, and I've never consistently seen it make a positive beneficial difference. And for the most part, I think it makes sense to maintain a relatively normal water intake. Some things that happen when you dehydrate a lot or you drink a lot of water, it changes other things like electrolyte balance, because your body's trying to maintain a certain level of body water to stay alive. So other things that people end up manipulating is their electrolytes, like either sodium or potassium. And that's largely based on a misunderstanding of the sodium-potassium pump. The idea that you can increase intracellular fullness by increasing potassium and cutting sodium to decrease extracellular, that's not untrue from a pure chemical kind of perspective. But the problem is that intramuscular is not the same thing as intracellular. And subcutaneous is not the same thing as extracellular. In fact, the vascular system is extracellular, and that's where you want a lot of your body water going to actually be pumped into your muscle while you're doing your pump up to deliver nutrients, etc. And I've seen over and over and over again people who cut sodium, load potassium, and then cut water. They're backstage and they can't catch a pump to save their life, even though they've loaded a ton of carbohydrate. And another reason that might be is that the glucose transporter in the gut is a sodium-dependent channel. So that means if you are cutting sodium and loading carbohydrate, you might be inhibiting your ability to actually get that glucose into your bloodstream, into your muscles for glycogen. So I can see a number of reasons why this kind of old-school strategy of loading potassium, cutting sodium, and cutting back on water is problematic. And typically what I do is, if anything, we increase the sodium intake a little bit, maintain water levels, and then do a not crazy, but a moderate, carb load to try to make sure we can get undepleted from all the weeks of dieting. And this typically results, of course, you have to individualize it, and you have to babysit it, you have to watch it over multiple days. This can typically result in a more fuller, leaner look on stage.
That's terrific. And the build up to that is obviously kind of a slower, steadier build up versus the, what you see in the movies with a 2 or 3 week nosedive to the finish line.
Yeah, it's always odd to me when people go like peak week is horrendous, and I know immediately what they're talking about. They're doing depletion workouts, they're cutting carbs drastically early, and they're loading sodium, and then they're going to cut sodium back, and they're going to load a bunch of carbohydrate while restricting water, load potassium, and all of that at the same time. It feels like death, no doubt about it. And I think, just from a very pragmatic perspective, if you looked great 2-3 weeks out, and you should, then why would you change absolutely everything? I think it's important to look at, if you're having high days or refeeds in your strategy, look at when relative to your high calorie, typically high carbohydrate days, did you look your best? Was it the same day? Was it 2 days afterwards? Maybe you tended to get a little softer looking after you load a large amount of carbohydrates. And then try to replicate that when you go into your peak week. And everything else can stay roughly the same. You don't want to be sore on stage, so maybe you cut back on some of your more eccentric dominant movements, and make sure you don't train on, say, like Friday. But some people cut out training completely and then do all that stuff I talked about as well, or at least they cut out leg training completely. And to me, if that is helpful, it probably is just indicative that you're creating way too much damage in your leg training normally. And that's probably more of a systemic issue if you're not training appropriately for bodybuilding. So there's there's so many kind of wrapped in assumptions and mythological lore kind of approaches that are probably not beneficial. And I see very inconsistently in traditional bodybuilding circles, do athletes get on stage looking well peaked. And I think this is one of those things where the emperor has no clothes, and people are just still doing it the same way, just because it's done that way. And I don't think that is still not caught up with even just kind of trial and error. I don't expect bodybuilders to be too tuned into science, because there's very little science that actually serves them. And what little there is not always applicable. And I do my best to kind of educate and share that information and provide useful recommendations. But certainly around peak week, there's nothing. But even then, I just don't think that bodybuilders are doing a good job in traditional circles of actually just looking at, I tried this and X happened. Most of the time, it's like, I tried the same thing that I do every time, and it still didn't work, but I'm going to keep doing it because everyone says I should do that. And I think it's about time that needs to die away.
I mean, yeah, great insights, and just being a bit more intuitive, and really listening to the body, and fantastic evidence-based insights here as well from you, Eric. I want to definitely respect your time here. So last couple questions for you here. On the personal side of things, you're obviously a really busy guy. Can you share with listeners a little bit how you start your day? You have a routine? Are you a coffee person? You training in the morning? How does that look?
Great question. Yeah, I have a lot of things going on. And so partitioning my time is very important to make sure I get it all done. I typically have a pretty light breakfast. I'm never hungry in the morning, so I'll wake up and I'll have like a whey protein bar. And then I will start working on some of my lower stress kind of work, which for me, even though this goes against many, many recommendations, is I just start with emails and make sure that I'm just staying on top of communications with everyone. And I'll do that for a couple hours, and then I will block off some time prior to lunch to work. And then we'll typically have a lunch with my wife, unless she's in class. And then from there, I'll work some more while the food's digesting, and then we go train. And then when I get back from training, that's typically hangout time, and just quality time with my wife, or we're seeing friends or doing things unrelated to work. And then on days I don't train, I get a lot more done. So that's, depending on the week, 2 or 3 days a week where I'm not training. And those are days where I can really kind of go in and spend a good block of 6 hours in a row getting stuff done. So yeah, I try to be pretty holistic about it. When I was doing another thing I really recommend and I think about is that not only do you have to manage your time, you have to manage your energy. So some tasks require really no creative energy. They're filling out something in a spreadsheet, doing your taxes, things that are basically just monotonous number crunching, busy work. And other things like writing a blog post or creating a YouTube video or writing a chapter in a book or writing a research review article, those take a lot of creative energy. And even if you have the time to do them, if you don't have the creative energy to do them, that's really inefficiently wasted. I think we've all anyone who's tried to be a content producer has had those experiences where they've sat down and they've got 4 hours blocked out and they produce maybe 2 paragraphs. Exactly. It's a total
more
slog.
Depressing.
Yeah, and I've learned over the years that when that starts to happen, I stop immediately. I'll pull the plug. I'm like, this is not going to happen. And I start working on things that don't require emotional energy. Like, hey, I've got to get a lot of this menial stuff done. Maybe I need to do some programming for clients. Like that certainly takes some creative energy, but I know what I'm doing. That's something that's a lot more. I don't have to pull something out of the ether to be creative. Exactly. So during my PhD, I would format my thesis. I would get my references sorted on EndNote. I would write the methods section, which is really just, okay, what did I do? Not try to write the discussion. And I take that same tact now once I finish my PhD with classifying things as things that take time but don't take creative energy or emotional energy, and things that take time and do take creative or emotional energy. And I think it's very important to strike when the iron's hot and not trying to force something when it's not there.
Oh, fantastic tips there, Eric. And to wrap things up here, last question for you. Maybe not an easy one, but what's the evolution of research in bodybuilding? Where are things going to be going in the next 5 or 10 years? Is there going to be more data coming out showing us the best way to do this? Where's that headed?
I'm actually very optimistic about the future of research in bodybuilding. I think once it was shown that there was some interest in this, we've experienced a bit of a renaissance in bodybuilding research. I got to give some good credit to Layne Norton, who I think was probably the first person who really popularized. He did his PhD. He produced research. Certainly we've had PhD level kind of leaders and coaches in bodybuilding, like Joe Klimczewski comes to mind. But Layne was the first one who started to produce research and showed, hey, this is a career you can follow. You can go get a PhD from a respected university and then just go do bodybuilding stuff with it, And I think a lot of people have followed in those footsteps. I being one of them, Peter Fitchen being another, and I can think of a lot of others who, like Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, Alan Aragon, James Krieger. There's a ton of people out there who are not only science communicators, but are also involved in primary research now, who are producing things. And those people who are kind of walking in both worlds, like the people I just mentioned and myself, have also shown some of the more pure researchers that, hey, there's an interest here. You can get some of the most read articles on the in certain journals by looking into this area. So people like Stu Phillips and others have kind of taken up the call and been like, hey, we can definitely produce more stuff directly in this realm. And I think that's really cool. And I really appreciate all those people who are producing research that's a little more relevant to our strange little niche sport. And I think the same thing is true of powerlifting as well. So it's been very cool to see. And it could just be selection bias now that I'm doing monthly applications in strength sport, which is very much targeted, at strength and physique athletes, that I'm looking at the research each month that comes out that's relevant. But it seems like there's a lot now, which is cool. So I'm very hopeful.
Awesome. That's awesome stuff, Eric. Really appreciate it. And, where can people keep up with all your phenomenal research and work, and where can people stay connected with you on social media?
Awesome. I'm so happy I can share that information. So I would check out 3dmusclejourney.com is kind of a one-stop shop that leads everywhere else. You can find links to monthly applications in strength sport there. If you want to stay up with our research review, you can find our YouTube channel, which is a little more kind of basic. Not basic, but it's not as nerdy. Let's put it that way. It's a little more practical application and a little more what do you do versus, we analyze the methods. Awesome. And then you can also find the links to the muscle and strength pyramids, which are very, very research based and a ton of references, but they are very much, and here's how you should set up you or your client's training. And then if you want to follow me on social media where I link to all this kind of stuff, check me out at Helms 3DMJ on Instagram. And then also I have a Facebook, which you can just Google Eric Helms on Facebook. And if you really want to get into it, you can check out my ResearchGate profile, where anytime I can release the full text to any of my studies that I've done or been a part of, I will do so on there. So yeah, that's pretty much